People don't realize this, but India is an agricultural superpower. Largest producer of milk in the world, largest producer of cotton in the world, largest exporter of shrimp, largest producer of spices and pulses, number 2 in everything, rice and wheat and fruits and vegetables and sugar. And we're really helping to unleash what's being built in India, and very proud of the catalytic work we've done over the past 12 years.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the AgTech Top Startup Series. We've looked at well over 5,000 companies within agriculture and food tech globally to identify what we think are, or at least try to define what we think are some of the best founders, but also investors around the world within these industries. And we're here with one of them, Mark Kahn. He's the managing partner of Omnivore. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me here, Kyle.
Absolutely. For those who don't know Omnivore, they have well over $100 billion in assets under management, to pretty hefty portfolio companies of 35 plus startups. I think even more important, their premier agtech fund rising out of APAC region that has most of their investments have made substantial impacts to the globe. I think you guys reached well over 6.5 million farmers, probably much more than that now today. You created well over $1 billion in economic value for smallholder farmers based on the companies that you've supported and helped grow. I mean, your guys' mission and the work that you've done is absolutely incredible. You are a fantastic investor looking at the portfolio as a whole, and also working out of a region that is a pretty challenging, also very unique, but extremely important. So, Mark, I appreciate the time. Can you share a little who you guys are, what you guys are working on, and if there's a backstory, we'd love to hear where Omnivore started.
Happy to tell our origin story. So Omnivore is the oldest, the largest, and the most active agri-tech, agri-food tech investor in Asia. We have been around now for 12 years. We started off our life as a corporate venture fund. My story, the 15 years some odd that I've been working out of India, began in 2007, 2008. My background is agribusiness, not originally investing. I moved to India to help with the turnaround of a large domestic agribusiness company called Godrej Agrovet. That was in the midst of a turnaround at that time. I was there about 6 years, and we successfully turned around that business. During that time, we originally launched Omnivore as a corporate venture fund, sponsored, promoted by this domestic agribusiness company. And that was the first few years of our existence, was really kind of very closely joined with them. In 2016, we became more independent and raised a new venture fund in 2017-18 of just shy of $100 million, and have been deploying that across 2019, 2020, 1 and now 22. We're in the last year of our investment period. We are, if I think about kind of sector, stage and geography as ways to think about funds, from a sector perspective, as I said, we're agri-food tech. We look at 6 themes that we think encompass everything relevant in our region, which are farmer platforms and fintech, agri B2B marketplaces, farm to consumer brands, precision agriculture, post-harvest technologies, and agri-food life sciences. From a stage perspective, we are early stage. So we do seed rounds, pre-A's, series A's, follow on through series B's, not beyond that, to be honest. And finally, from a geography perspective, historically, we've just been focused on India. And some people immediately react to that saying, well, is that enough? Do you need to look beyond that? And I like to remind people that feeding 1/6 of humanity keeps us busy. The thing you have to remember about India is it has 130 million smallholder farmers. There are millions of intermediaries, whether we're talking about traders, processors, retailers, various SMEs in the agribusiness ecosystem. Agriculture is 1/4 of India's economy. It provides almost half the population in the country. So yeah, it's a TAM, a total addressable market, of almost $1 trillion. And people don't realize this, but India is an agricultural superpower. Largest producer of milk in the world, largest producer of cotton in the world, largest exporter of shrimp, largest producer of spices and pulses, number two in everything, rice and wheat and fruits and vegetables and sugar. So it is an economic powerhouse of agriculture, and we're really helping to unleash what's being built in India, um, and very proud of the catalytic work we've done over the past 12 years. Omnivore there are there are 15 of us now. It's a great team. Everyone comes from the ag sector, and so we add a lot of value add to every startup that we work with.
It's absolutely impressive what you guys have done or created and also invested into. And I'm curious, you talked a little bit about, pretty significantly long history. And it makes sense now that you guys basically spun out of a corporate venture arm. Were you guys making a lot of investments from the corporate venture arm in the early days, or was that more strategic partnerships?
We never had that much funding back when we were earlier, kind of more closely linked to the corporate. But the other thing is that, the truth is there wasn't that much deal flow back then. We were years ahead of our time. Like it's almost comic to me. And I'll explain that in two different ways. One is to say that Godrej Agrovet is one of the best agribusiness companies in India. They were incredibly, incredibly prescient to help us get off the ground. And Mr. Godrej has been a tremendous supporter and is a visionary in Indian agriculture. And I think that's why they supported us from our earliest days. And so we have nothing but great feelings for the vision they have for transforming Indian ag. The funny thing for me is going to agri-tech conferences now. So the biggest in the world is Rethink's World Agri-Tech, right? It's part of an overall Rethink week where you have Animal Ag Tech, World Agri-Tech, and Future Food Tech, and it's 5 days. San Francisco. It was in late March. Everyone in the whole global ecosystem was there, convening for the first time physically in 3 years. And it was a really intense conference because the truth is a lot of us are more than peers, more than colleagues. We're actually friends. We're drinking buddies. We've been at this for so long, it's ridiculous. And so there was a lot of like, hey, hellos, but there was also a lot of like hugging and crying. I'm not even kidding. Like one person hugged me and was like, I'm just so happy to like be in the same room with people again, because the truth is in venture, in startups, the real joy is people. Like this job behind a Zoom screen sucks. It is so much more fun to be in the trenches with entrepreneurs. And this conference, you could just see how happy people were to be there. But I was talking to a long time peer from the fund Cultivian. And if you look at the venture Cultivian Sandbox, and if you look at the kind of evolution of agri-tech VC, I think the oldest fund in the space technically is Finisterre. And I know that because in 2007, when I was at Syngenta, I helped write a business plan that later became Syngenta Ventures. And we deep dove everyone who was doing back then ag-related VC. And Finisterre was like, I think the only dedicated fund. So they're the oldest. Cultivian is the second oldest. And Terra, which used to be Rabo Ventures, is probably the third oldest. And honestly, and I would love it if someone challenges me on this, I think Omnivore is the fourth oldest because we really came up in 2011 and started investing in the space. Maybe I'm off by one or two, but it's very funny for those of us who have been at this for so long. I was talking with this fellow at Cultivian, and I'm like, do you remember when there was no conference? Do you remember when it was four of us on a panel? Like, like all of us who had a fund in this space were on one panel, jammed into a conference about agricultural land. And we had a laugh about this. I mean, the space has really evolved. It was brutal, slow goings, I think, really until about 2015, 16. And that's when I think an inflection point, certainly in India, we reached an inflection point in 2016, 17. But I think kind of globally stuff started to take off around that.
Hey, I know I share similar sentiment coming from as a Southeast Asia based investor. Starting 2013, 14. That period is very interesting. How things kind of developed across a variety of categories. only
Yeah,
now.
I mean, yeah, I mean, as a Southeast Asia-based investor, like Indonesia was nothing until it was everything.
And only now are we starting to see really a lot of exciting things going on in agriculture that is just really impressive. That it's hard to see that just a long time ago. I mean, there really wasn't much going on, but I mean, you guys are really focused on, you talked about those six categories, and I like how you mentioned it's really where you see opportunities within your region. Is that kind of how your investment thesis just arose? Those are the verticals, the six verticals that you wanted to go after?
Not at all. I think that that is after many iterations of looking at the space over a long period of time. It's also we're a data partner for Ag Funder in India. They're great friends, peers. We have nothing but respect for them. They have their categorization of deals, which to be clear, I think from a US and Europe and Israel perspective makes a lot of sense because you have a lot of chunkiness in each of these categories and that categorization works really well. In India, I think that categorization in some cases a little bit too specific because a lot of deep tech in India is still a little bit earlier to start subcategorizing the deep tech as much as they do. And in general, in emerging markets, the trends we see between the upstream and the midstream are very different than what you might see in more developed markets. And so we think of it as that categorization as three full stack plays and three deep tech life science plays. From a full stack perspective, farmer platforms and fintech, these are people that are trying to organize at the farmer level, right? And remember, India has 130 million farmers. We have in any given category a huge number of farmers. We have 7 million silk farmers and 80 million dairy farmers. And the numbers boggle the mind. But the point is that is a big, big business, just organizing all of those farmers with inputs, outputs, financing, market linkages, storage, um, embedded fintech advisory, right? So that's one big play. A second big full stack play is midstream related, right? So that's upstream. A second big full stack play is midstream related, which is to say, right, how do you organize all of the middlemen, the retailers, the traders, the what we call artias, commission agents, brokers. So there's a whole bunch of models focused on the middle of the value chain, right? Um, you know, it, like Bijak is a big play in that space, right? Or for example, Agrim for agri input retailers. Um, for farmer platforms, as I mentioned earlier, that's more like Dehat, Aqua Connect, Resha Mundi, Paradagri. And then downstream, there's a bunch of agri-tech stuff that's really disintermediating between farmers all the way to urban consumers, right? Companies like Deep Rooted, which used to be called Clover, which is building the largest fresh produce brand in India, or Farmly, which is building one of the largest nut brands in India. It's going to be like the Planters of India in a few years. So there's a bunch of full stack stuff across farmer focused, middlemen focused, and consumer focused. And then there are three kind of deep tech themes: precision ag, right, which is broad based farmer facing deep tech; post harvest technologies, which are what it sounds like. How do you apply deep tech from the point of harvest onwards, right, to processing and trading and quality and everything else, traceability? And finally, the category that we call agri-food life sciences. A lot of other people would break that into a million pieces. And what we feel is there's so little of that. That's the most nascent part of our ecosystem in India that everything that's related to chemistry, biology, biochemistry, synthetic bio, right? That's all one across food, across ag is all one thing because that's, to be clear, the least active part of our ecosystem and where Omnivore is trying to kind of kick things off now as we look to the future.
No, it makes sense. And it's exciting to see kind of how that evolves. And I have a few follow-up questions that a little bit later on, but I like how you mentioned in the beginning and especially introducing Omnivore about how the size of the scale of the agriculture ecosystem within your region is just absolutely mind boggling. And, feeding 1/6 of the people is no strong feat. But as a venture fund, I'm curious, you know, I, I look at your portfolio as a whole. When you're investing in a lot of companies, especially within the specific region of the world, also within solely within agriculture, there's a lot of opportunities, but it also feels like there could be a lot of overlap as well. Are you guys investing in technology companies that may or may not be competitors? How do you manage that? Are you just picking the best winners from every single one of those categories that you mentioned before across those six verticals? Or just
I mean, I
from
think
each prop to prop?
we get this question a lot. And I think it's the less close you are to the ecosystem, the more similar the companies look. When you're actually kind of looking at the forest from the ground level, you can see the difference between the kinds of business models, the type of subsectors, the approach, and you'll start understanding why the companies themselves aren't that worried about the fact that we're in something that's a bit similar. Look, we're a sectoral VC, right? Our stuff will be adjacent to each other by definition, right? Everything's working in ag. And even if someone starts out focused on one thing, they may pivot and find themselves directly competing with something. At the time that we invest in companies, right, in any given fund, they're not competitors. Sometimes they evolve that way. We're pretty good at running those firewalls so companies feel comfortable with the fact that we might be in someone that eventually becomes a competitor. Our goal is to transform the ecosystem, and so we're very, we're happy to see lots of winners.
And, you guys have been obviously since 2011, you said, um, investing in emerging markets is tough, especially when you guys are primarily focused on India. I mean,
I don't know, man.
mm,
I think India is better than most emerging markets.
yeah,
We have a lot of things that other emerging markets don't. We have a massive domestic exchange and huge amounts of both domestic retail investment into our stock market, as well as foreign institutional investment into our stock market. Right. So you can take companies public in India. It's harder to do it in, you know, Kenya, let alone like a Malawi, right, or some other truly kind of frontier market, or a Cambodia. Not that Cambodia and Malawi are the same thing. Let's be clear. I've worked a lot more than in Asia than I have in Africa. We also are a key destination for M&A. So we've sold, right, portfolio companies in full, nice, big, fat exits, right, to other global companies and large domestic companies in India, because it's a big enough geography to be an M&A destination, right? You can have the best company in Laos, but doesn't really move. It's very different than having the best company in Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, which is still very different from having the best company in India, right? India is, again, a sixth of humanity, right? It's a huge geography for ag globally. And as emerging markets go, for all of our challenges, India's the third most active venture capital ecosystem in the world, right? Like legitimately the third, right? Was $45 billion in the last 12 months. So, as much as people, pull their hair and, rend their garments and say, oh, emerging markets are so hard. I don't know. I think that India creates certainly a lot of challenges, but it's also a much more interesting geography to work in than I think doing agri-tech in a lot of other places. The fact is, I don't know if you ever read this article, but one of my ex-colleagues from Syngenta and good friend Shubham Shankar wrote this really good at Syngenta Ventures, wrote this really great LinkedIn piece about 2 years ago called Agritech in the 2010s. And what it was about is how agritech was supposed to be disruptive, but ultimately wasn't, right? And I called him and I was like, man, what are you doing? Like, you're going to try to destroy the entire industry? And he's like, no, nothing I said here applies to India. Because his point in the piece was like, okay, so agritech globally was like trying to improve farmer profitability. But like when you're trying to improve farmer profitability in California, you're trying to improve the profitability of the most efficient farmer in the world. That's just not the case in India or in Indonesia or in Vietnam or in Philippines or in any emerging market. And our potential to create much more value for our farmers is there. It's much easier to do that than it is in developed markets. And so I actually am much more bullish about emerging markets agritech than I am about developed markets agri-tech. I actually think in the developed markets, the food tech stuff is much more interesting. The downstream alt protein, let's, in the laboratory completely reinvent everything. I think that's much more, relevant and interesting. Or even in the input space, companies like Pivot Bio, right, that are like, hey, fertilizer, let's get rid of it. I think the scientific acumen of the developed countries is what's really their advantage. I think from a, let's digitize it, let's marketplace it, let's embedded fintech it. It's much more interesting in emerging markets.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I mean, could you imagine just being able to increase just by a small fraction yields or efficiency of 130 million farmers? Like it's unreal with the impact that that could have just alone. But what is the demographic for a typical farmer within India across these 130 million farms?
Farmers are not different from other people. You cannot generalize 130 million people. You can't generalize. It's like there's 600 million people with their families. It's like generalizing. It's like saying Americans are this or Canadians are this, right? Not particularly useful to kind of make those generalizations. I would say Indian farmers fall into, 3 or 4 major groups, right? There are what we would characterize as progressive farmers, right? These are, sometimes it correlates with age, younger farmers, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just inherent aspects of curiosity. These tend to be, in the top third of the 130 million farmers, though not all of them. And some that are very, very big and wealthy are not at all progressive, and some that are much smaller are progressive. They tend to be more I think of it as like a psychographic, right? They are experimental, they're early adopters, they're readers, they're voracious consumers, right? They're always trying to figure out how to make more money. What's the side hustle? What's the new crop that no one else is growing, right? How do I do aquaculture, sericulture? How do I do poultry, right? How do I take these 3 hectares or 2 hectares that I have and maximize my income stream? How do I disintermediate? How do I value add, right? That's about I would say, and maybe it's not a third, maybe it's the top 20 or 30%. And then you have the vast kind of middle, right? That is traditional. But the thing you have to remember about agriculture in India, and this is a bit of a misnomer, whenever people are talking about smallholder farmers, right? A lot of times they conflate subsistence farmers with smallholder farmers. Now, subsistence farmers are smallholder farmers, but not all smallholder farmers are subsistence farmers. Indian farmers, Bangladeshi farmers, Laotian farmers, Cambodian farmers, and Vietnamese farmers, these are all farmers that have surpluses for the most part. They don't just grow to feed their families. They grow commercially, even at a small scale. And so they are all like small business people. And so you have the very progressive ones, right? But you also, under them, have a bunch of traditional ones that are still trying to make money, right? And then India and the bottom 20 or 30%, those are still, right, economically fragile subsistence kind of farmers in our tribal areas and our most remote states. But they're only 20, 25% of the overall, right? And it's kind of like looking at any other economy, right? Are you focused on the bottom 25%? We are focused, all farmers in India, almost all farmers in India are still what you would say globally lower income and poor. But there's huge differences between that top 30% and that bottom 20%.
I want to shift gears to your investment portfolio here. And I wanted to ask, I know you said around 35 plus companies already in your pipeline today. Is there any companies, most recent investments that you want to highlight or companies that you're currently excited about?
There's, I mean, again, I know the analogy gets said a lot, but it's like asking parents, like which child. Um, I think there's a lot of exciting stuff in our portfolio. Our most recent investment was announced late last week, Tractor Junction, which is building out the largest platform in the agri mechanization space in India. Fantastic entrepreneurs working across, used and new farm equipment and rural commercial vehicles and rural vehicles in general. Before that, we announced Krishify, which is literally building an agriverse, right? It's a place where, farmers and rural citizens and communities and agribusiness people of every type can engage, communicate, share, and transact. That's pretty exciting. We announced Agrizy, which is trying to revolutionize food processing in India. There's some other investments where we are expecting some big announcements over the next few months, like an Aqua Connect and Fossil. And yeah, I mean, I'm very proud of the portfolio we've built, and definitely Indian agri-tech the last couple of years has been on a incredible point of inflection.
One of the things I realized when I look at kind of the global landscape of ag tech, when you look at more, US, Europe, maybe Australia, you see a lot of companies that are building enterprise services or solutions, IoT products, robotics that they sell directly to farmers. Wherein you look at Brazil, Indonesia, India, it seems to be a lot of, you start with more of a marketplace and then you build features on top of that, whether that is, adding on imagery solutions, how farmers improve yields or understand their crop, but they reach it a little bit better. Whether you have, a little bit more of a management solution, helps farmers just manage regular traditional operations. But that's not what's sold. It's more of either there's a marketplace or financial services. And I kind of feel like if you look across your portfolio, at least from what I've seen, almost a third of your companies are almost kind of like a marketplace to some extent. And I'm curious, do you agree with that sentiment? And
Oh
maybe
yeah.
explain to the audience why that is the case? Why is it mostly
It's what
marketplace?
I talked about. You have 130 million farmers. You've got millions of middlemen that sell to them, that buy from them. Before you do anything in this ecosystem, you have to build an information layer over it. You have to build an organization layer over it, right? Otherwise, you can't get deep tech to market. You can't get life sciences to market. You can't get innovation to market. So much of what we've seen in the last few years are entrepreneurs that are saying, hey, I'm going to organize this market. I'm going to modernize this market. I'm going to build a full stack platform, a marketplace over this. And eventually people will build additional things on top of that. But the low hanging fruit is the organization of the market. But these marketplaces are all doing very different things. They're operating in sectors as diverse as silk, aquaculture, goats. Big mutton's a big thing in India. Food processing, textiles. These are all different spaces with very different market dynamics. So you can't just, there's no one platform to rule them all, right? There's very different businesses that have to be built in each of these segments.
And I guess, you talked about how the information layer is going to be the most important sentence, the stone carrying things forward. What do you see for India in the next 5 to 10 years?
I think in general, what you're going to see in the next 5 or 10 years is much more deep tech, right? Much more deep tech, much more life sciences, much more fintech, things that require, that build on that distribution, that build on that marketplace, that build on that platform, that once you've solved for those problems, can then create more value for those farmers, right? More science resulting in more innovation and more value creation for farmers, I think, is where we're heading to. But you couldn't do any of it without solving the distribution problem.
I want to shift gears now to more just general market questions. I mean, started to get into it just now, but you mentioned about the conference that you went to recently. And, it's obviously the big elephant in the room is I'm really just curious how the pandemic has affected the agriculture industry within India, or at least within the APAC region.
So I think it's useful to understand. I actually want to rewind the clock to understand why the pandemic was as catalytic as it was, because it was incredibly, like, for 2 years everything has gone up and to the right. But it's useful to kind of set the stage for that. So if you fast forward, if you rewind from, say, March of 2020 for like 4 years, right? 19, 18, 17, 16. What happened in the years going to the pandemic? Okay. I think one big thing that happened was a variety of digital programs, investments, and partnerships in India built a stack that facilitated the digitization of what we call the bottom billion in India, right? India has 1.4 billion people. The first couple 100 million were already getting online, right? By, say, 2010, 2015, right? The hard part was getting that bottom billion. And they are now to a great extent online. But the question is like, what got them? What got them there, right? And so, number one, so the question is kind of what got them there. So number one, you had ubiquitous 4G. India has built 4G in every corner of the country. I cannot stand driving in the United States and Canada. The connectivity is garbage compared to India. Okay. It is trash. Americans and Canadians don't realize, and Europeans don't realize how bad they have it. Go to Asia and understand what actual connectivity looks like. Number one. Number two, the cost of mobile data in India is the lowest in the world. Some of that's thanks to geo, but also the competitive pressures. So mobile data in India is just cheap as hell, right? And that encourages high utilization. Then, then we have third, then we have the UPI, the Universal Payments Interface. The Universal Payments Interface in India is the most advanced fintech system of any country I've ever seen. I think American fintech's a joke. I think it is absurd that people say, oh, Venmo me this or PayPal me that. You know what I do in India? I use a Google Pay app and I wire money for free from my bank account to the bank account of a, coconut water vendor on the street. Okay. For free, instantaneously, right? None of this Venmo me bullshit. Okay. And so like we have the best payments interface, right? And finally, digital identity. So India, right? It doesn't have a lot of these concerns that folks in the US necessarily do as much. There was an urgency towards digital identity as opposed to a precautionary principle with respect to privacy. And so India built what was called the India Stack, based on a national ID number, interfaced with a public sector bank account, interfaced with people's mobile numbers. And so everyone has a unique mobile ID. And all of these four trends essentially digitized, right, the Indian economy and started going deeper and deeper in the rural economy. So that's one big thing. Second biggest thing was talent. Talent in Indian startups for a long time was tentative. And then it was like, okay, this could also be an option. But by 2016, 2017, the best and the brightest in the Indian IITs, our engineering institutes, or the IIMs, our management institutes, MBAs, right, we're all pouring into startups. And that continues to be the case. And nowadays, the founders of most agri-tech startups have come from other successful unicorn generalist startups, right? So we have this incredible, right, kind of growth hacking, blitz scaling set of talent that is coming into agri-tech. Third, capital, $45 billion last 12 months, enough said, right? India is front and center for both domestic and international capital coming into startups. So line up those three things and COVID basically lit a match, right? All of a sudden you had primed the whole system to take off. And then the COVID lockdown started in late March of 2020. And every conventional supply chain in agriculture collapsed on the input side, on the output side, on the financing side. And it was the agri-tech startups that stepped into the void and helped keep agriculture going. And as a result, have been on a tear ever since. And so that's really what COVID did to our ecosystem. COVID broke the status quo. And when the status quo broke, all of a sudden, tens of millions of farmers tried agri-tech platforms for the first time and liked what they saw. And while, I won't say that none have gone back to the status quo, some certainly have, most are sticking with these new, innovative, digitally native approaches to doing business.
Wanted to switch a little bit over to a different topic though. One of the things that I noticed across agriculture is this concept of sustainability. And it's seen in every industry vertical and subcategory. This seems to be somehow. And I'm just curious, do you see this in your neck of the woods? Or are you
Oh, for sure.
thinking this super important to founders locally? And also, why now? Why is this becoming a big topic now?
I think for Omnivore, sustainability and climate have been big themes for us for many years now. There are four pillars of our theory of change, of our vision for Indian agriculture, which is improve farmer profitability, enhance farmer resilience, and then, improve agricultural sustainability and catalyze climate action. So it has been a major priority of us for many, many years to address the environmental side of Indian agriculture, that you can't transform an ecosystem without fixing the environmental bottlenecks that are going to otherwise become the limiting factors in it. Um, as to why it's center plate, COP26, right? If we think about agriculture, agriculture is both a major emitter of greenhouse gases, but also the most vulnerable sector in the world, right, to climate change. And so you're on both sides of that. You need the mitigation and you need the adaptation in order for agriculture to survive. And so I think that's put it on everyone's plate, irrespective of geography.
You guys put together a 2030 uh, vision
Vision.
report, which I think has talked about 8 major trends we expect to see over the next 5, 10 years here. Maybe for the audience, do you want to share a few things that you from that report you'd like to talk about? Maybe some of the trends or what your overarching vision is for the future?
Look, I mean, I think I think the point of Omnivore 2030, right? Our vision 2030 was really, the fact is we were all stuck at home during the pandemic. And we decided to use that time of being utterly shut in to try to imagine a better world, right? To try to imagine what Indian agriculture could become. And so we talked about themes like how precision agriculture and automation are going to create a farm of one, where every farm is going to have its own customization driven by digitization. That biotech would produce tastier and more nutritious crops as opposed to just higher yielding ones. That farmer consumer intimacy is going to improve value for both parties, right? And that you're going to start seeing a more diverse and sustainable set of food sources, and that foods will increasingly and scientifically replace medicine. We were just sort of imagining a future that didn't suck as much as the four walls that we were all stuck within. And I think it's useful. Do I think it's necessarily 2030 or 2035? I don't actually care, right? The point is, it was a vision for what the world could look like if we can just get our shit together.
So with that, Mark, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. This is really, really impressive. Uh, Maybe is there anything where to close out? Any things that you'd like to mention to the audience, highlighting the unique aspects of your fund? Really great learning experience today. A lot of things that you mentioned. Super excited about the future. Would love to hear what's next for Omnivore.
I mean, look, we launched our newest fund, just opened it up to new investors in in March, I guess 2 months back. So we're in the process of putting together a 130 $150 million new fund, continuing to target innovators in agri-food in South Asia. And we think that, this story of the transformation of Indian agriculture and food systems is just getting started, that we have, in 2 decades, we are going to revolutionize the way the world works and the way, the lives of smallholder farmers globally work. And so, anyone who wants to learn more about that should reach out to me. And it's an honor and a privilege to be on the show. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kyle.
Well, thanks, Mark. I really appreciate you taking time to chat with us and share a lot of details about what's happening within the agriculture ecosystem, especially within India. Really exciting. And for the audience, just to take a step back, why we had this interview, back to see today, we looked at thousands of agriculture companies around the world and also hundreds of different types of investors. And the goal is to identify what we think are some of the best investors in the world. And you got to see one of them. Omnivore is hands down phenomenal. And Mark mentioned earlier, what are the original four funds really pioneering this space? If you are an ag tech startup or if you are an investor, you have to talk to Omnivore. They are the best and the brightest within the region. And they'd be a great partner to work with. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate taking the time.